As Bill said, we're grateful for each person that's here in person, and it's just always a privilege for us to spend time in God's Word. I've entitled our discussion on 1 Corinthians 13, I will show you a more excellent way. And as we go through this, I have intentionally repeated some things, just mainly for emphasis. And the central idea is love is missing in much of the life of the church in Corinth. As I read all the New Testament letters, I just keep reminding myself they've never done this before. They're relatively new Christians. And some of our old frontier preachers had a country expression. They said, sitting in a church building doesn't any more make you a Christian than sitting in a chicken house makes you a chicken. And you can be in the right building at the right time, but not have the right things on the inside. And we will just be talking about Paul's discussion of a more excellent way. 1 Corinthians 13 is not only maybe one of the best known chapters in Corinthians, it's one of the best known chapters in the New Testament. But this discussion is kind of in the middle of chapter 12 and 14, which are discussions about spiritual gifts. And 1 Corinthians 13, in its original context, I think is Paul's discussion about the lack of unity in the church, the abuse of the gift of tongues, jealousy about other members' gifts, lawsuits, impatience with others during worships, the tolerating of immorality, and the chaos that developed when they dissembled, and the list goes on, and we'll come back and touch on these things. And again, 1 Corinthians is actually 2 Corinthians, because in chapter 5 and verse 9 he says, in my former letter. So we know that there's already been a previous letter which has not been preserved for us. And so Paul's discussion and contact with this church has at least 3 letters that are involved with it during his time. I just did a list of some verses, and again, context for 1 Corinthians 13. The Corinthians are divisive. They're inconsiderate in their treatment of one another. They are comparing humans above Christ. Remember, I'm of Paul, I'm of Cephas, I'm of Apollos. And hopefully there's a few people that say, I'm of Christ. And I'm not trying to be sarcastic, but they have just totally missed the point of so many things, and especially even Paul himself. Only Christ is here, but a part of their immaturity and their growing understanding is that they are having humans on the same level with Christ. They are jealous, conceited, puffed up, some translations will say. They are shameful, self-seeking, and quarrelsome. I sometimes try to imagine what would it be like to worship with a church in Corinth. I may have a few times in my past. Anytime we lose the Spirit of Christ and the sense of the larger part of the plan that we're just a small part of, you can actually just miss the plot of the whole reason for being in the church. So 1 Corinthians is a negative commentary on the actions and the behavior of the Corinthian church. And we're going to repeat this twice, but notice. Virtually everything that Paul says that love does, they are not doing. And virtually everything that Paul says, oh, love does not, they are doing. For example, love is patient and love is kind. So here's a church where the members are being critical of one another, they're exalting gifts, and again, they're in lawsuits. When they get together, they're eating, not a fellowship meal. Some have food, some don't. They're choosing sides. And they're actually spiritual children. They're immature in their current grasp of the overall plan of salvation. We had talked about the concept of the body, and Paul is going to do this in 3 different letters where he will refer to the church just like a physical body, and will have different applications in different verses. But Warren Wiersbe pointed out these 3 things, and I thought these were very helpful. When Paul talks about the body, he will talk about unity. Unity from the point of view that it is a gift of the Spirit. But then he will also then talk about diversity, because there are different gifts, plural, that the Spirit gives to help the church. But the gift from the Spirit, the gifts of the Spirit, are given to help the church in its state of maturity and for it to grow and to become more mature. So a couple of comments. Unity and diversity must be balanced by maturity, and that maturity comes with love. It is not enough to have the gift of the Spirit and gifts from the Spirit. We must also have the graces of the Spirit as we use our gifts to serve one another. Spiritual gifts, no matter how exciting or wonderful, are useless and even destructive if they are not ministered in love. When Paul speaks about the activity of the body, he will always mention love. And I thought this was an interesting comment. Love is the circulatory system of the body. So when we read 1 Corinthians 13 in context, then this is in the middle of 2 chapters where Paul basically saying, because you're exalting one gift over another, because there's a sense of competition and jealousy between the gifts, a familiar term in our society is you're majoring in minors. The greatest focus and interest has been diverted to the gifts that are temporary in comparison to the eternal nature of love. And this is just my term. He begins his discussion with the Corinthians' problem child. They are so fascinated with the gift of tongues and other miracles that gifts were actually given to confirm the word, and these had been exalted, the gifts, away from the primary point of the message. In talking with parents through the years, and it doesn't matter the number of the children, sometimes 3 or 4, but I've heard some parents say, one of our children required more attention than the others did put together. Bless their hearts. We were in a congregation, and I heard more than one elder say about a member, we have lost more sleep over this one member than we have the rest of the whole congregation. And a part of the reason why I think we have 1 Corinthians in our New Testament is that there are always going to be different times of growing pains in congregations. There's going to be different challenges. And because in their spiritual youth, they have missed some things so far, then Paul gives very, very clear teaching about what they should be and what they should be doing. So number 6, 1 Corinthians 13 is a commentary on the actions and the behavior of the Corinthian church. And again, for repetition, everything that Paul says love does in 1 Corinthians 13, they're not doing. And everything that Paul says, well, love does not, well, those are things that they are actually doing. And I've mentioned this in the past. There have been times that a couple has come in and we visited, and for whatever reason, there's some kind of struggle, competition going on. And most of the time, as we just talk through things, what are we going to do for next week? I just tell them, in 1 Corinthians 13, two of those early passages are, love is patient and love is kind. And while we're struggling to kind of work some things out, this week, can we just work on being patient and being kind with one another? Because in our relationships, if we're not patient and kind, we don't have to worry about the rest of the list in 1 Corinthians 13. And then when you look at the fellowship of the church in Corinth, these are not two of their strengths. There's all kinds of division, there's all kinds of competition. Can you imagine coming to church with people that you're involved in a lawsuit with? In the book of Philippians, one of the main petitions is Paul is going to exhort for two women to agree in the Lord. And I was at Harding a few years ago, and one of the older preachers was saying he was visiting a church, and he came to this verse, I plead with Euodia and I plead with Syntyche to agree with one another in the Lord. And he said, and I just said, two women can cause all kinds of division in a church, and immediately the church started looking at two women who were in that congregation. He said, I had no idea how practical this lesson was going to be. And that's the nature of the New Testament. At different times in different churches, all the things that we read about will be going on in a local church. So while they are critical, they're evaluating one gift over another, all the problems that are going on, Paul says, I will show you a more excellent way. 1 Corinthians 13:1. And this is, we're going to use the term biographical. Notice the use of I in this first section. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. And if you'll notice, all of these are gifts that the Spirit has given to equip the church toward maturity, and the tongues, the prophetic powers, the gift of faith, understanding mysteries, knowledge, and all of these are actually gifts that are in the church, but they're also items of conflict in the church. If I give away all that I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. So here starts a list. Love is patient and kind, and we're going to point this out in a second. In verses 4 through 7, he's going to begin, again we have that parentheses type thing, two very positives, and then a whole list of things that love does not do, and then the eternal nature of love. But notice, love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. And some translations will say, it keeps no record of wrongs. It does not rejoice in wrongdoings, but rejoices in the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. Love never ends, And again, here we're back with the gifts in the Corinthian church. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. And as for knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part, but when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, and then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. Now abide faith, hope, and love, these three, but the greatest of these is love. I just want to comment on two of the things that are here. I don't know in every situation, but I'm thinking about tongues for a second. And again, because just through the years we've had a lot of contact with people who are involved in Pentecostal churches with various gifts. When you look at the speaking of tongues in Acts 2, they are actually other languages. This is not a gift. This is just the nature of the congregation. When I worship with the Belmore Road Church in Melbourne, it's nearly, I would guess, nearly 60% Asian. And for example, Charles, one of the elders, he speaks Mandarin, Cantonese, Malay, and English. And so anyone who comes from Southeast Asia, there are 20 different nations that normally worship together on Sunday. So it doesn't matter which country, if you're a visitor, you come from Southeast Asia, and isn't this nice? Someone can speak to you in your native tongue while you're there. Yes, the worship service is in English, but it's just a blessing to have a church with such diversity in it, because it's in a wonderful way for people to feel welcome. In the early parts of the Pentecostal movement, some people were convinced that they could go to foreign lands having the gift of the Spirit and be given the ability to speak in these languages. And some of those people lost their faith because they couldn't speak in a language. A person has followed different, again, Pentecostal groups in different parts of the country, and it's actually a learned response. He took a tape recorder to different meetings, and he said, I can listen to someone, quote, speak in tongues for 5 minutes, and I can tell them who they learned it from. All I'm saying is the ability to speak in tongues today has nothing to do with speaking in languages. And in the first century, the speaking in tongues may also be as much a gift of the ear as it is the gift of the tongue. Do you remember the list of countries that are given in Acts chapter 2? And what did the people say who are listening to the sermon? We hear the message in our own language. And the same way, again, with everything from raising the dead to the other things, there is a lot of promises and false hope that are given in a lot of Pentecostal churches that would have been met in the first century. And it's hard to say because you don't ever want to be harsh or cruel, but no one can do the gifts, the miraculous gifts today, on the level and in the way they were done in the first century. And with these people having these gifts, then in 1 Corinthians 13, Paul goes through, and you'll just hear at different times, the speaking in tongues, the faith, the mystery, the knowledge, which were gifts that were there. And all of those things are given in contrast to what he's calling them to a more excellent way, and that's the way of love. So 3 things that I'd like to just highlight in the chapter. In the first 3 verses, love is enriching. And when you look at this, Paul is basically saying all the spiritual gifts in the world without love are useless. And if you had small children, none of us appreciated someone who gave your child a drum or cymbals or something like this just because of the enthusiasm that they had with that. And I always kind of grin when I read this. A noisy gong, clanging cymbals, moving mountains, and giving our bodies to be burned are all illustrations of the futility of any human action that's not motivated by love. Secondly, in addition to enriching, I love this word edifying, and we're going to look at this in a different context here in a second. Biblical love is more about specific qualities and not just emotions. And when you come to these lists that Paul starts giving, he switches from adjectives in the first 3 verses to specific verbs. And his focus is not primarily on what love is by itself, but rather what love does. And so 2 of the things that love does, it's patient and kind. And then there'll be a long list of things that love does not do. And you'll keep hearing these, love is not, love is not. And then he will say, the reason this is so significant is that love always, and you hear this, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things, and he comes back again to the permanence of love. So when you read verses 4 through 7, again, like this parentheses, a very positive, love is patient and kind, and then the love that bears all things at the end, but in the middle are a discussion of the negative things that the Corinthians were not doing. So on the next page, so even with the positive things that are going on in Corinth, they are not being patient and kind. And again, jealousy, lawsuits, and these other considerations. So the third thing, love is enriching, love is edifying. Paul says love is enduring. Our understanding, and I think this side of eternity, in one sense or another will always be incomplete. But with all of the gifts that were given, Paul is very specific. When all the gifts have finished, and we'll see even when faith and hope have been completed, the one quality that he is calling them to have on earth will be the primary quality that will be with them through eternity. So here are illustrations of our present limitations. A child versus an adult. And speaking even of his own life, Paul says, when I was a child, I thought like a child, I spoke like a child, but when I became an adult, when I came, there's our term mature, I gave away childish things. The second is the difference between a mirror and direct vision. Most mirrors in the ancient world were polished metal. And Corinth was known in the ancient world, in their trade, the business, the vocations of making polished metal mirrors was something that Corinth was known for. And Paul is saying, yes, I can kind of see dimly, but then I'll see face to face. One of our long-term elders' wives at Eastside was Betty DeBoard, and her favorite hymn was Face to Face. Face to face with Christ my Redeemer, and face to face, what will it be when with rapture I behold him, Jesus Christ who died for me. And I don't know that any of us can fully comprehend what it will be like to be near the throne of God. And so the comparison is, in this world, we see through a mirror dimly, and we can see, and it's there, but there will be a time where things will be much clearer, it will be face to face. And then the other is the contrast between the partial and that which is fully known. So I'd like to read through these characteristics of love, and this could be expanded and be virtually even the whole lesson. But let's just look at these, and again, the majority of the things in this list are things that are missing in the church in Corinth. So love is patient. Another translation is love suffers long. Sorry, this last part I thought was helpful too. Paul gives characteristics of love to a church that has the all things are lawful for me going on. I'm going to do what I want to do because I can do it. And Paul says love is patient. Some of the translators, and this is not in our written translations, use the term love is not short-fused. They are not only patient with circumstances, but patient with people. Love is kind, actively engaged in doing good to others, undeserved generosity. Love does, and here's our list of nots. Love does not envy. It doesn't make negative comparisons about the actions of others. Love is not puffed up. It does not boast. It doesn't have an inflated sense of one's own importance. It's not arrogant or rude. It does not treat others in a selfish or offensive manner. Love is not self-seeking, self-centered. It does not insist on its own way or its own rights. Love is not easily angered, not easily provoked. Love gives a thoughtful response to the words and actions of others. This is harder sometimes than others. Love keeps no record of wrongs. And the word here is logizomai, and this is an accounting term. And we've all been in a relationship with someone and something happens, and at some point they will just recite a list of things from the past. And it just, another way to say this is love doesn't keep score. Love doesn't keep accounts. Love does not rejoice in wrongdoing. It takes no pleasure in evil actions. Love rejoices in the truth, celebrates the truth. Remember, Paul says, whatever things are true, think on these things. And then here comes the kind of the eternal nature of love. Love bears all things. It always protects. And that's the idea, to hide something by covering. It is not trying to expose another's shortcomings. Love believes all things. It trusts. Love looks for the best in others and in God's promises. Love hopes all things. A quiet confidence in the final victory of the grace of God. And love endures all things. Steadfastness in times of trial, and active, positive fortitude about the future. One writer gave these eternal things in a negative way, and I thought this was still good. Love never tires of support, never loses faith, never exhausts hope, and it never gives up. Love keeps us from becoming discouraged with immature people or difficult circumstances. And Christians have the advantage of not just reading a list of love qualities. When the Word became flesh in the life of Jesus, we see these qualities realized and actualized. I want to do something from the book of Acts just very quickly. Paul and Barnabas were spiritual bodybuilders, because the body is a term that's used a lot. And if you'll notice, in this missionary journey, they're going to go back to these young churches, Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch. And notice these two things: strengthening the souls of the disciples and encouraging them to continue in the faith. And when you listen to the word strengthened, Luke is going to use the word stirizo. Do you hear it? What do you hear when you hear the word stirizo? Steroids. Can I use the term spiritual steroids with no harmful side effects? Here are young Christians, so let's go back and strengthen the souls of the disciples. Let's help them to become more firm. Let's help them to be stronger, more unchanging. And what Paul and Barnabas did in person, Paul is going to be doing when he writes his letters. And one of the things he's doing as he gives this list of love is trying to strengthen the souls of the disciples in their growing nature of love. When you look at the second word on the back page, the idea of encouraging is to appeal to exhort. And even though 1 Corinthians would be a challenging part of the letter for the Corinthian church, Paul's purpose is both to strengthen and to encourage them. It's always appropriate to use Scripture at different places, okay? So I totally admit that, but this is also still true. 1 Corinthians 13 wasn't primarily written to be read in candlelight during a wedding. There's a sharp critique and criticism of the behavior of the Corinthians in this chapter, and Paul is on the attack against the immature behavior of this church. And in the same way that the brother I was talking about starts talking about Euodia and Syntyche, and people start looking at these two ladies who are on opposite sides of the church, who are having difficulty in this church, 1 Corinthians will be read aloud in the assembly at Corinth, and I suspect things get very quiet during chapter 13, because some of the Corinthians might identify, especially the things that love does not do. Oh, that's what we are doing. He is actually talking very, very specifically to us. So because love is used in so many ways in our society, I think this is still helpful. Love is a verb. It's a deliberate response to human beings based on how God in Christ has loved us. And love is ultimately defined by the selfless sacrifice of Christ on the cross. It's a way of life, and it's how we respond because we've been loved. It's an action rather than an emotion. Toward the end of this, Paul is going to talk about faith, hope, and love, which is a trilogy that he uses in other places. And as Christians on this side of eternity, we will walk by faith in the promises of God, on which we placed our hope in the future fulfillment when Christ returns. And there will be a day, and think of this, when faith becomes sight, when hope becomes reality, but love will still endure. And on this side of eternity, these are indispensable Christian virtues: faith, hope, and love. And what Paul is saying, as important as they are right now, the reason he places so much emphasis on love is that that is going to be the quality that goes with us into eternity. So, love never fails. And I chose three things. One, God's love is the beginning point. Let us love one another, 1 John 4, 7 and 8. Love is from God, and whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. And anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. And then 4:19, we love because he first loved us. Lord willing, a verse we'll come to in 2 Corinthians, the love of Christ, and this is a big word. ESV will say it controls us. Some translations will say it constrains us. And other translations will say the love of Christ compels us. And then when you read the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 5, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, and the list goes on. So whether you're talking about God's love for us, Christ's sacrifice that controls us, and the love that is part of the fruit of the Spirit, all of those come to us. So love is the identification of ourselves with God's interest in others. And I've left this out because it's such an important part of the whole lesson. But it's so important that we are being known by God. And there's too much to say to put this in today. What matters is what God has done, is doing, and will do in the future. So here's our summary. Verses 1 through 3, autobiographical. If I, and here's all these lists of things that are useless without love. And then there are examples of love in action, these verbs, and the superiority of agape love. Now abide faith, hope, and love. And think about this. Faith and hope are a human response. That's something that we're called to do in response to our understanding of the will and the plan of God, whereas love comes from the essence of the nature of God himself. William Barclay had this wonderful little comment. He said, "Love is the fire that kindles faith, and love is the light which turns hope into certainty." Love is a way of life that comes to us from God as we imitate Jesus. Love is about action, how a person lives for the Lord and obeys him, and how a person lives for others and serves them. And love is about being, because it comes from the heart of God. I'd like to close with a quote from Leon Morris. No commentator can excuse himself from the duty of trying to make plain what these matchless words have come to signify for him in their beauty and holiness. And no Christian can excuse himself from the duty of trying to show in his and her life what these words have come to mean for them. Now abideth faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love.